Thank you all for being here. This is a really cool deal. I'm Dwayne Pullman. I'm with the Cincinnati Pro Chapter Society of Professional Journalists. We're doing this in conjunction with the SPJ Mid Michigan Professional Chapter. And welcome to this. This is really important. And it's going to have a longer shelf life, as they say, because we're republishing this to help journalists. And that's what this is all about, to help journalists get through the stress of what we're doing tonight. We had done this a month ago with Bruce, and it was an important thing to kind of acknowledge where we are as journalists and how to deal with our own stress. And tonight is an outgrowth of that. An important part of that is how we deal with the trauma of others. And it's pronounced in the people we cover, but we're really not trained on how to deal with it. We kind of come up with our own style, but we're pragmatically trying to get stories, and we're covering people at the most vulnerable time. And that's where we get, especially on the television side, since I'm sitting here on the television side, I'll freely admit, how do you feel is an easy answer for television purposes. But does that do something to the people that we cover, or is there a better way to do this? How do we do this without creating harm to those we cover? And how do we do it in a way where we don't diminish what we do and harm ourselves? So that's what tonight's all about. And again, we're just so honored to have Bruce Shapiro. If you don't know him, the executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. Bruce, as we were talking about earlier, we've known each other a long time. I think the world of him. He's a fantastic individual. He's been honored in his field. He really is leading the way. And before it was even cool, he went into this whole idea that trauma is something we really need to take a look at and kind of get through a better series of professional journalism measures to to help us be better journalists. You have to get through this thing of where we just take on the harm and create harm because we don't know what we're dealing with. And he's really led the way. He's a thought leader. So um, I just want to say on social media, it's Cincy SPJ. If you want to talk about this, just make sure you tag it. That'd be very helpful, and we appreciate that. And there will be time at the end of this for your questions. If you'd like to reach out to Bruce after, he has an email address. I'll put on
Yep.
here. It's bruce.shapiro@dartcenter.org. I'll put it in the comments section. But I want to get out of the way and let Bruce do what he does. Bruce, thank you so much. We're really honored.
Oh, well, thank you, Dwayne, and it is great to be back here with all you folks. And the question of how to cover vulnerable sources and how to cover human beings who've experienced the worst that life can deliver is so central to all of our lives as journalists. We cover um, whether we're on our first jobs or our last jobs. We cover death and trauma and tragedy. And this year, at this particular moment, obviously we're living in the middle of news cycles that are drenched with violence and loss and tragedy. Um, and that poses enormous challenges. I do direct the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, as you know, which is a project of Columbia University Journalism School based in New York City. We were started now 22 years ago, and part of the core mission is, in fact, this question of effective ethical reporting on deeply traumatized sources. And some of that involves understanding what's going on with people in the face of horror and tragedy and violence. Some of it involves the craft implications of that, the ethical questions we ask ourselves, the storytelling questions we ask ourselves. What I want to do is give you a little science on you, a little bit about what's going on with people, whether it's survivors of crime, survivors of police violence, communities that are deeply traumatized, or at a higher level, even whole societies, talk a little bit about this and a little bit about the issues that come up when we're doing interviews and so on. Um, Before I launch into my formal thing, though, and I guess, Dwayne, you can advise on the best way to facilitate this, but I wonder if a few of you could either, I don't know whether it's to throw into the chat or just leap in, whatever's worth, with the things that you find the biggest challenges in covering people in the wake of trauma. What are the things that you find especially difficult or that you're hoping to learn about out of this? Dwayne, what would be the best way of
I
doing
mean, you
that?
could either do it open mic or
Let's
people
just do it
for a
open mic.
shot. Yeah.
I mean, if you want to raise your little Zoom hand, if you know how to do that, you can. But on the other hand, if you want to just unmute and shout something, what are what do you find? Yeah, Ginny, start us off.
Accessibility, and I think like people's emotions too are often at a high level.
Yeah.
Those would be two that come to mind.
Yep. Yep. How to manage, especially that sort of a high level of emotions with folks. Anybody else want to leap in with maybe something that you've experienced in your own reporting? Jenny, go for it.
This is Jenny, and I would say just knowing the line of sensitivity and how to be sensitive to topics and also be respectful of getting the truth. Getting the story, but also you're a human being first before you're a journalist. So it's about kind of figuring out how to be sensitive to what has happened to a person, and yet knowing you're also going to have to ask some tough questions.
Yeah. And that is at the core of it, isn't it? I mean, I kind of prefer to think that being a journalist is an expression of being a human being rather than a second identity, but they certainly can sometimes seem in tension when you have to ask difficult questions or bring people through a difficult experience in order to do the job, right? That's a part of it. How about one more? Anybody else have a kind of favorite challenge? Yeah, Thomas.
Well, going into a situation where someone's lost a family member or the family member of theirs has been charged with a horrendous crime, you go knock on the door as your journalistic duty. Let's say if someone's died, hey, can we have a picture? I mean, I'm not doing that tone, but that's one of the challenges. And then the other tone is, especially if a parent or a relative of someone who's accused of a crime, those require extreme sensitivity. Sometimes you'd be surprised how many times those people will talk and spill out their guts because they really want you to know. Most of my approach was, I don't care about the crime or what happened there. I want to know about the person, about you, how you're feeling, how your reactions are.
Yeah.
That switch to that kind of approach seemed to help quite a bit.
Yeah. It's the questions around families of perpetrators or perpetrators themselves, especially considering how often perpetrators themselves end up being people who've had significant trauma histories or victimization experience. But that very delicate question of asking people for stories or all photos, all of that, they're so challenging, partly because of the emotions that are on the table, partly because we imagine ourselves or our family members in that same situation. And also it's awkward and it's distressing to us. What I'm gonna do now is go to my PowerPoint, which means I got to share the screen, something which is never my favorite part of the day, but I'm gonna do it anyway. There we go, and we'll go to full screen. And what I think all of you, because you've been reporters, whether it's at the community level or regional level or national level, all of you, I think, have experienced the idea, the fact that people who have experienced tragedy or crisis or conflict are different. I mean, this is a collage of events from a few years ago. That's Iraq and Bosnia and Northern Ireland and Hurricane Katrina, a woman who was trafficked in El Salvador. There are some characteristic challenges that you probably have all experienced when you knock on those doors or when you make those phone calls or when you're doing those features and investigative pieces. So often people we talk to in the wake of trauma may have difficulty trusting us, or they may rush at us, too much trust. You may, I'm sure some of you have experienced this, especially on crime stories, gotten that 1,000-yard stare, that emotional disconnect where someone's affect seems out of sync with the degree of loss or degree of violence they've experienced. Or people who are really fragmented in trying to relate a story, or awash in shame, or awash in anger, or having a hair trigger for anger, sometimes at you. Anyone who's worked on an investigative story knows that, or a longer feature involving a really traumatized source knows that feeling of people who want to be in the story and then pull back, or there's this kind of dance. Those are all characteristics that we as reporters encounter in survivors of trauma. And the interesting question is why? And the why is important because it leads to important reporting craft challenges and ethical challenges. What I want to do is lay down a little bit of language for understanding trauma, understanding people's encounter with violence and horror and the aftermath of it. So I'm going to do a little science for you, and then it will get practical really fast because I'll be talking about reporting issues. Okay. The best way, and I think I probably said this on my last talk, which was a little more about self-care, but the best way that I know to understand trauma is as a biopsychosocial experience. That is to say, human reaction to overwhelming threat or violence or cruelty or abuse that operates on 3 levels at once. And to understand this, you need to sort of think in your own life to your own biological response to fear or biological response to traumatic events. And I don't mean, don't be thinking about the worst thing that ever happened to you. But if you think about yourself in, let's say, a fender bender, a screech crunch kind of car accident, that nothing too terrible happened, but it was scary in the moment. You know that feeling in which at the moment of impact or the moment that that sound of the squealing brakes gets hit, your smart journalist brain turns off, frankly, and your survival brain kicks in and you do a bunch of stuff that is entirely instinctual and is about your body's wiring for survival, right? You heart starts to beat faster because you got to get blood to muscles to run or fight or flight, all that sort of stuff. If there's injury, your brain is going to pump out natural endorphins so you don't feel so much pain. Time slows down. Your brain encompasses details. There's all kinds of stuff that happens, right, when you're in a moment of real fear, a threat. And this is great. This is our body's wiring to survive. But if fear is great enough, or threat is chronic enough, sometimes people's brains and bodies, all of that stuff that's happened in the moment of fear, don't recalibrate to baseline. You know, after that screech crunch kind of fender bender, you know, probably a couple hours later, you're calmed down, you're feeling okay. But if threat is severe enough, people can be changed in permanent ways, which, you know, these days psychologists call post-traumatic stress disorder or psychological injury. And it's biologically rooted. It falls into several categories of biologically rooted changes that are psychological because they keep going. There are changes in memory. Trauma memories are more accessible. They're stored in a different part of the brain than normal biographical memories, different mechanism. And as a result, they tend to be intrusive. People can be awakened every night. Soldiers awakened every night with combat nightmares. Survivors of torture who wake up every night in their prison. But sometimes it's flashbacks or memories. Someone who's trying to concentrate on tonight's homework and last year's police beating just keeps coming back on them. intrusive or bodily memories, sense memories on anniversaries or in the presence of triggers, the presence of reminders. Intrusive memory is one characteristic, memories that are too present and come out in unwanted, uncontrollable ways. Anxious arousal. Sometimes all of those neurotransmitters that pump out when you're under threat, they don't recalibrate to baseline, or if someone has gotten accustomed to chronic threat, people have a higher level of anxious arousal. They become more anxious. They have a harder time concentrating, harder time getting to sleep, maybe harder time holding the story together, harder time getting along with people. You think of, again, the classic image of the kind of highly agitated combat veteran. That's a biologically rooted change in psychology, in people's relationship to the world and to themselves. And the intrusive memories, the anxious arousal that sometimes come in the wake of trauma, those are both really overwhelming. So the brain also goes the other way. The brain sometimes pumps out those endorphins and people become numb and avoidant in the face of reminders of trauma. They may avoid any situations that would trigger these high stress responses. They may bury memories where the brain biologically does not let them remember. They may become numb, have a harder time feeling anything because any emotions risk putting this spin cycle into place. Numbing, avoidance, that's the third great characteristic of trauma that you'll see in folks you interview. And a darkening of the worldview. Psychologists call it negative cognitions. People who begin to see threat everywhere, who experience a lot of shame, live in a lot of anger, all those kinds of negative things are part of the psychological injury that happens when these biologically rooted changes take hold and persist over months and years and lifetimes. And then there's the social level. And as reporters, we walk into this one all the time. To go through life as human beings requires a high degree of social trust. A couple hours ago, I had to go to the little greengrocer across the street to get some stuff for supper. And for me to cross the street in New Haven, Connecticut and get my broccoli and whatever actually requires a crazy faith that none of the cars on my slightly busy street are going to run me over, that no one in the store is packing weaponry anyway. We get through life through this kind of denial, but you all know that parent who's lost a child in a school shooting, that sexual assault survivor, that soldier who suffered terribly in war, these are people for whom the world is no longer such a safe place. Trust is much harder. And we walk into that challenge of building trust thing all the time. And all these symptoms together, these biopsychosocial changes together represent genuine, enduring alteration in people's relationship to the world. On the terrain that we rely on the most when we go and report on them, okay, people will encounter those changes where memories flood them, or where they're just anxious and jumpy or can't concentrate, or where they go the other way and are numbing and avoidant. All of those things are characteristics that we will see in the aftermath of trauma. Not all the time. I mean, the reality is that people are quite adaptable and resilient, but these are common responses that we'll see, along with these psychosocial consequences that play out. People who are isolated, covered in shame, or alternating between shame and rage, all of that sort of thing. For us as journalists, what we need to understand about trauma survivors is that so often people are trapped in what the great psychiatrist Judith Herman calls the dialectic of trauma. They're caught between wanting to speak and believing that nobody will ever understand, between remembering and forgetting, wanting to feel connected to others and feeling profoundly isolated, wanting to trust us as bearers of the story, and having a hair trigger for betrayal. that's what we walk into. And I'm sure that all of you have had experience in your reporting with folks in one way or another, these kinds of issues. The question is how we approach it. And as a reporter, so that's the science I want to lay. And now I'm just going to talk craft. The question is what that means for us as reporters, how we go about the work. And for me, while keeping a whole lot of this sort of science in my head, actually the most useful frame that I can think of is about power and powerlessness. That these biopsychosocial changes all stem from a radical loss of safety and a radical loss of power, no matter what someone's original social status. In the face of genuine trauma, they've lost power over life and death. And so many of our rules and so many of our craft skills as reporters are actually built for people who have a fair amount of power. You know, mayors and police chiefs and presidents and business leaders. We follow all kinds of interview rules and things that are very effective in those settings. The question is, what is going to be effective with people who've lost power over their own safety, and whether recently or long ago, and who in some cases have lost power over these changes in their own lives. All the smartest reporters on trauma that I know, including people who reported on Me Too, people who reported on migrants and refugees, people who report on criminal justice, understand this power dynamic. And they think about a trauma interview approach that involves ways of recognizing this powerlessness and giving some power back in ways that we would not in other kinds of interviews. So, and a lot of you may do some of these things instinctively, but I just want to, lay them out. We will do things like seek unusual levels of permission. If I go interview the mayor of New Haven, Connecticut, I'm just going to say, Mayor Elliker, I'll be there at 2:00. And, if I'm interviewing, a refugee from Syria who moves in a couple of blocks away, I'm going to say, well, let me explain what a reporter, what I'm doing and when the story can come out, and unusual levels of permission. I may invite my interview subject to choose where we meet, which I would never do if I'm trying to report on the police chief. Talk more about, don't use jargon when talking about things like on the record and off the record, but really talk through the process of reporting, especially if it's an in-depth kind of story. May sometimes invite a subject to have a third party. You want to have your sister there? We wouldn't do that again with the mayor. It's a kind of a more collaborative process. Sometimes we'll even invite people to review their quotes. That's, this is not an exhaustive list. These are examples of seemingly small gestures that nonetheless communicate agency, control, and power to people who have lost often so much agency that the only thing they have power over that's left is the story itself. A second crucial area, and a couple of your questions sort of got to this, is we need a tool belt for anticipating and managing the emotional responses of sources. There's Eric Nalder, a great investigative reporter, now retired from the Seattle Times and the former editorial training director from Hearst, has this wonderful strategy that he calls the inner interview, which again, some of you may do instinctively, but it can be very useful with a trauma interview, where on your way out there or in the shower beforehand or whatever, you actually run through it in your head, you game it out, not scripting it, but what's your first line? What are the things you want to make sure you say? What are the decision points you will face, that your source will face? And, anticipate where the challenging places will be. All of that can really help convey a sense of calm and control. It's a very useful technique. During interviews, what do we do if sources become upset, distressed, as may sometimes happen? Well, sometimes our tendency is so we see someone getting upset, we may want to stop, right? And that can be the first impulse that we have. This is actually a bad idea. If our goal is to give agency to our source, um, if you sense them being distressed, you might want to put a choice to them. You seem, I know this is hard. Do you want to take a break? But you don't want to be cutting people off because they seem too distressed, unless they're really psychotic. I mean, that is a whole thing, but rarely will happen to any of us in the course of reporting. Tears, horror, all of that. There's two reasons you don't want to just cut them off. One is that it actually takes away their own agency and control, and that hurts. The other I have found is that so often trauma survivors need to know, if they're going to trust you, that you can manage and contain their distress. I remember a Holocaust survivor, a partisan, saying to me in the course of an interview, when I must have betrayed some emotion that I still don't know what it was, it caught him up short, and he said, "Hey, this is my story. If I can tell it, you can hear it." Right? We need to plan ahead for distress so that we can manage it, which demonstrates our trustworthiness. Similarly, keeping balance and boundaries. Trauma survivors, because they're so often caught between trust and not trust, or remembering and forgetting, all of that, they sometimes have a hard time managing personal boundaries. It's a very common thing. They don't know who to trust. They may trust us too much. They may think we're their new best friend. They may start calling us at all hours. There's all kinds of stuff during interviews or after. And it's really important that we maintain our professionalism. We can believe, sometimes it's easy to think, gosh, I just need to be their friend. I need to be sympathetic. The reality is that when we let sources' deep distress drive the car, that's more distressing to them. They need to know why we're there. And so sometimes little things, like for me, I use these days yellow pads more than notebooks, but I'll keep a notebook out in sight during an interview as a way of kind of reminding people why we're there. Um, if we say it's going to be an hour, I'll really try to keep it to an hour, or at least get their permission before continuing. Do little things to impose some structure and to keep balance. And when sources challenge those boundaries, just kind of calmly explain why we maintain them. If someone says, well, starts calling you at 10 at night, you say, listen, I don't pick up the phone after 8. If you leave a message, I'll call you tomorrow. All of that helps people who are really distressed manage their own ability to participate in this. What do we do after? By the way, you'll notice I organized this into a BDA, a before, during, and after strategy, which is a very useful way of thinking about the planning for trauma stories. BDA, what do we do before? What do we do during? What do we do after? After, if you have been interviewing somebody about really tough stuff, do they have support? You can say to them, sometimes it's kind of common after a difficult conversation like this to feel a little worked up. Is there someone you usually talk to about that? Or do you want to have, you're going to see someone later today, or whatever. Some journalists I know will actually carry around, especially if they're community journalists, will carry around the card of a community mental health clinic if someone needs that, or expresses a desire. We're not social workers. That's not our job, but there's nothing wrong with connecting people to resources that are just there. And you want to follow up. You want to tell people when the story is going to come out. You want to do it in an organized way, etc. We can talk more about that. But a before, during, and after plan, enabling you to manage distress and manage difficult stuff that happens. The most important question is, what can we ask? And what should we ask? And one way that actually I find the journalism world has changed, one generational shift, is certainly back 20 years ago when I was, and now, 30 and more years ago when I was first starting reporting. We never worried about whether our interviewing was going to fuck people up. Pardon my French. We thought our job is to get the story, and consequences be damned. That's changed. And in fact, in the years that the Dart Center has been doing this work, I've noticed a shift from people really needing to be sold on the idea of trauma as something to pay attention to being reporters who are actually scared of interviewing traumatized or vulnerable sources, fear of causing re-traumatization. Here, I want to share some good news with you, okay? The research that's been done on people who have been interviewed for scientific studies and for other purposes suggests that being interviewed about a past trauma, while often distressing in the short run, emotionally challenging, asking someone to recollect the worst loss of their lives or the worst violence of their lives or whatever, it can be hard. It doesn't actually change the long-term outcome for people. It's not giving PTSD or triggering PTSD that didn't already exist. Um, it's not damaging automatically to interview trauma survivors. And in fact, to the contrary, there are a number of studies suggesting that to trauma survivors, being interviewed can have a distinct value in validating their experience, making them feel less invisible, taking away shame, connecting people who thought the extremity of their experience would never be recognized, connecting them to the broader public. There was a study done many years ago of torture survivors in Chile, um, some of them who testified before the country's Truth Commission, some of whom did not. Those who testified did better in the long run. And there's a much more recent study, just a couple of years ago, of Yazidi women who were interviewed by a number of journalists after being subjected to sexual violence and other kinds of abuse in ISIS occupation. And these women, a number of them, when they were interviewed by psychologists after being interviewed by reporters, a number of them felt some anger at reporters who they thought had misled them or were manipulative. But overwhelmingly, they felt that they were glad to have participated in these interviews. They wanted the world to know. And when we interview people about trauma, and we do it right, whether it's about a child who's been lost or about their own experience, we are often helping folks undertake a survivor mission, a sense of reconnection or a way of helping people not go through this again with someone else, or all kinds of things. So the question comes, if we are going to do these difficult interviews, what should we ask? Because, we've all heard the really terrible interviews that were, well, how did that make you feel after, like, their child was killed or something like that? And that's pretty awful. We don't want to be that reporter, right? Years ago, I asked one of my psychologist advisors this question, a woman who has been who's treated sexual assault survivors for years in New England and genocide survivors in Rwanda. I said, okay, I get that we're not supposed to say, how did this make you feel? What should we be asking? And my friend Lori's suggestion was just ask, what happened to you? That sounds like a simple formulation, what happened to you, and it is, but it's actually quite profound. What happened? There was an event out there in the world. What happened to you? This is not something you asked for. There's no implied blame. This is something you suffered. What happened to you? And that also invites narrative rather than feeling, and authentic emotion, authentic quotes, authentic feeling rather than cliches will emerge if you just say, well, what happened? And what happened then? And what happened then? It's also terribly important with trauma survivors to not reduce them, even when we're on fairly short deadlifts, not reduce them to the worst thing that ever happened to them, but instead to learn as much as we can about who they were before the accident, the shooting, the war, whatever, what their lives were like, what about their family, what about their childhood, what about whatever, and also to lead them out. Ask people how they're coping now, what their life looks like now, what their typical day is, bring people back to the present. This is particularly important in trauma interviewing. You don't want to leave people stirred up in the moment of trauma. You want to bring them back to the present. Okay. There are clearly crucial ethical stakes too in reporting on trauma stories. Consent. Are people able to give meaningful consent, participating in stories, to having their story online, available forever? If it's right after a horrific event, sometimes people are in shock, they can't give consent. Sometimes people are too mentally ill to give meaningful consent. You've all encountered times when you might have questioned your own judgment on that. What about trust? Survivors have so much difficulty trusting us, and they often have a hair trigger for betrayal. Things like spelling someone's name right, keeping your appointments, all those sorts of things take on a special ethical meaning for that sexual assault survivor, for that migrant who's had her child put into separated from her. These are huge issues for us. Verification. So much of trauma reporting involves events for which there's no direct witness, or it's two people alone in a room. What kinds of corollary verification can we do, and how do we discuss verification with our sources? How do we portray people in a dignified way? How do we keep them safe? Right? These are all special ethical states. So there are a few questions that I think that we can be asking, and a few processes to go through when we're reporting on vulnerable people that safeguard our own ethical well-being as well as the ethical well-being of the story. First of all is the constant reminder of whose story is this. It's not your story, it's their story, and we do need to bear witness for them. Being as transparent as we can with vulnerable sources about the work, about what the process will be, not misleading them about how much change a story will bring in their life, being really straightforward. Simple accuracy. The stakes in accuracy are really, really high on trauma stories. Trauma survivors will take it as a signal, often as a reminder of a world gone haywire if you spell their name wrong or get some other fact wrong. On this one, I'll tell you a personal story. Many years ago, I was the victim of a violent crime that got a lot of press coverage, and a major newspaper of record reporting on me invented a wife for me who did not exist. A reporter misread a police report and invented someone named Bruce Shapiro who did not exist. I thought this was entertaining. But my mother was profoundly distressed for weeks and weeks on this incorrect bit of the press coverage, and it took a long time to get a correction. Accuracy really matters. Boundaries. Again, I said this earlier, but as sympathetic as you want to be, maintaining your boundaries with traumatized sources and maintaining your professionalism helps your sources. Traumatized sources, traumatized individuals need us to be bounded, to be containers, to keep roles and responsibilities clear. Keeping your promises. If you say you're going to show up at 2, show up at 2, not at 2:05. If you say it's going to be an hour, keep it to an hour, or at least get permission. If you say you're only going to fact check X, Y, and Z, only fact check X, Y, and Z, and then don't overpromise. That's really crucial. If you have fact check and verification issues, be really clear and direct from the beginning so that you're not ambushing sources late in the reporting process. Ambush is the worst thing for someone who has PTSD because they've got their fear thing, their trigger responses up like this, right? So ambush is the last thing that you want to do. And finally, accept complexity. Survivors are not saints. Sometimes they're perpetrators too. But even when they are not not perpetrators, survivors are complex human beings. They're going to be easy to work with in some ways, hard to work with in some ways, reliable narrators in some ways, unreliable narrators in other ways. Trauma reporting also involves a lot of storytelling innovation. How do we capture people's attention in a vivid way without being voyeuristic or sensational? It's a real tension. How do we put in enough detail to keep people going and to understand the high stakes of a story about combat or a story about flight from natural disaster, while keeping it calm enough for the reader to come away with something other than just agitation? How do we represent trauma survivors in a dignified way and that avoids cliches and stereotypes? I'm going to stop there because I think there's a lot to talk about. I mean, I also have some self-care slides in here if we wanted to talk about that later, but that was the focus last time, and I want to kind of stick to plan here. So I think I will stop sharing my screen. There we go. And come back to y'all. Dwayne, what was going to be the process now? Are we?
Well, we're going to open it up for Q&A.
Yep.
You guys can start typing in. I'm going to prime the pump a little bit here and hopefully get some of you asking questions. If you can open cameras up, that probably is helpful as well. If you don't know how to raise the hand, it's usually on your upper right. I think mine's different, so I'm in a different mode. Anyway, if you don't know how to raise your hand, just raise your hand if you're on camera. So I want to start you with this, Bruce. Here's one of the dilemmas is in the moment, as they say, we're all kind of Bill Clinton-esque, that we care deeply,
Yeah.
right? So we do, but it's kind of a without even intentionally trying to do this, it's a predatory thing in that we're trying to elicit that interview. And there's obviously what you referred to, the disconnect and sometimes misinterpretation of being misled. That I think for all of us as reporters becomes a big deal, because the last thing you want to do is further traumatize that individual by having them misunderstand what you're doing. What I try to do is I have my own thing. It doesn't matter. But what do you suggest on what you call that professional demarcation line?
Well, first of all, it's going to be different depending on whether it's more of a breaking story, more of a feature, more of a retrospective, more of an investigative. It's going to be, vary wildly. If you're there right on the scene or the immediate aftermath of a mass shooting or a state house riot, God forbid, or something like that, clearly your job is to be finding out baseline information. And I think it's that you can, there you just identify yourself as a reporter. You very clearly say, I'm looking for what happened. What did you see? And you just keep it to that. If you're trying to build rapport with someone for more of a feature or in the aftermath or something like that, you're all going to have your own little strategies that work for you. But I think the key thing is to be very straightforward and honest about who you are and what you're working on, and say, I'm doing a story on the riot at the Capitol last week. I heard you were there. I'm wondering if you can help me. And
but your point is it's case by case, because what I guess, and then we'll let everybody.
Well, I think it is case by case, but I think remember that, first of all, that in general, these kind of folks often have never worked with reporters before, so may not know what our job is or have a set of norms, number one, in general. Number two, when it's the terrain of trauma, anxiety responses go way up, and like the personal alarm system is extra high. One way to understand PTSD is as a permanently activated alarm system. So what that says is that you want to have a little bit of extra care in how you describe yourself, in how you describe the job. And you'll say, hi, I'm Dwayne, I'm a reporter from the TV station. And and you'll explain it a little bit more. I also find, I find people are pretty understanding once they realize you're a reporter and that you're not from the government or something, but you also never know people's hidden sources of shame.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is there's a long tail here in that
Yeah.
if you're really good at, connecting in a human way, they're going to come back to you because they're already affected in a PTSD way. And we're not trained in, as being counselors. So it's always a very difficult thing
Well,
after the fact.
you've got to allow extra time. Never try to rush a trauma interview. If you do, you will almost always fail. You will almost always come up against that fear mechanism, right? So, give it as much time as you can. Do a lot of signposting where you say, okay, now, I need to ask you something a little bit difficult. I'm going to ask you to remember, I know this was a difficult day. I'm going to ask you to remember it. Explain, why I want to tell I want people to know who your son was. I don't want him to be just a headline.
Yeah.
There's a reporter now retired, sadly, out in Everett, Washington, Scott North, who was a reporter at the Everett Herald for years, who tells this wonderful story about interviewing the mother of a Sonomish Native American teenager who died in police custody, and who was a little bit of a juvenile delinquent, and who died under very suspicious circumstances. And the woman, first of all, as a First Nations person who was never reported on, had no reason on earth to trust the Everett Herald. Secondly, there was a kid who died. There was huge grief, shame, all this. And Scott sort of just sat with her for a long time and then finally said, I remember when my daughter was 2 and I would lift her up and I remember what she smelled like. What did your son smell like at that age? And it was one of those kinds of long approaches that make human connection without saying I'm your best friend, right? And it's okay. It's okay to do that.
Let's open it up.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you have a question, please. Does anybody want to start this?
There's one in the chat from Brandon. How difficult is it to talk about trauma in an appropriate terminology?
Mm-hmm. So how difficult is it to talk about trauma? And then I think Lauren has her little Zoom hand up. Will be rewarded for figuring out how to do the Zoom hand. How difficult is it? Well, it depends on the person. No two people are alike. First of all, do know that just because someone has been through trauma doesn't mean they have PTSD. Human beings are actually extraordinarily resilient. And the kinds of long-term changes and long-term distress that I was describing doesn't always happen. And when it does happen, it's because usually a combination of cumulative trauma, individual genetic stuff, the very particular situation. So I tell my students to expect resilience, anticipate trauma, but presume resilience. You don't want to pathologize folks. They will feel condescended to, and you won't be able to get good stories. For someone who is really struggling with those enduring changes that we sometimes call PTSD, talking about trauma can feel very overwhelming. Okay, it can cause biological changes where people get tense and their heart beats faster, or you can measure on their skin their body heat changes and stuff like that. They may sometimes get flooded by memory, or they may shut down completely and become numb, or they may just be sad and weep, right? And all of those are predictable, knowable responses. If someone's really overwhelmed, you'll know when they're really in the zone and really lost. You'll recognize it. Doesn't happen very often. Okay. So I think, again, you want to be prepared for a range of responses and have a set of skills and think about things that have been helpful to you when people have talked to you in times of distress. And I'm not talking about so much the hugging thing. That I'm these days, I think we're all quite alert to the need to maintain boundaries around physical contact with people who are vulnerable. It's not wrong to give someone a hug, but it's something you want to be careful about. But you want to acknowledge distress without over egging, not ever over egging the pudding. You can say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry for your loss. Those kinds of human solidarity expressions are not cheap. They really matter, because what they say is, as a human being, I have solidarity with you. I'm not presuming to be your friend. I'm not presuming to know what you went through. Usually, even if you've got a parallel experience in your family or in your life, it's usually not a good idea to say, well, I know how you feel. My uncle went through the same thing. Because occasionally it'll work, but usually the psychology of the trauma survivor is that they feel isolated by the extremity of their experience. And it'll be taken as invalidating, even if you did have an uncle who went through exactly the same thing. Yeah, my uncle fled the czar too, okay? But and had to flee the cops. But people will feel they're not really being listened to. The most important thing is that people feel listened to. When they feel listened to, often the feeling will be one of real relief that someone was actually there. And just because they show tears or show distress doesn't mean that there's not also relief. So it's a combination of fear, distress, relief. It's going to depend on the person, but all of those are there. So Lauren, you've been patiently waiting.
Yeah, one thing that has come up in my reporting occasionally, especially when talking to people who their experience was a long time ago, or they're making a very specific allegation against someone. Sometimes it gets a little prickly when you ask for corroboration, like if someone else saw the incident or paperwork that they may have filed, especially if they said that they filed something, like asking how to find it. So I wanted to see if you could address some best practices for, encouraging the trauma survivors that sharing this information is helpful and will ultimately help them share their story better.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, you've hit on a really crucial issue. Because it's very important that we not give up our journalism standards, no matter how empathetic we are. If you do that, you end up like Rolling Stone. You end up really in a jackpot. So, and it doesn't serve the survivor well either, right? Well, one thing, first of all, let me just kind of flag something that you said at the beginning. When you're talking, one reason this is such a fraught conversation is that if you are talking to someone about an abuse that happened a while ago, trauma erases time. So that prickly response that you get is not just a present tense prickly response. Often they are back in the moment of threat, back in the moment of abuse. So when you say, I need to verify this, they're being reminded of the original assault or all the other people who said, I don't believe you. Like, it's all present because trauma erases time. So it's especially important to have a strategy for this, right? The best person I know on this is a reporter named Kristen Lombardi, who for many years was at the Center for Public Integrity. She now is actually my colleague at Columbia. She teaches at Columbia Journalism School, but she did a lot of the pioneering reporting on campus sexual assault, was actually the reporter in Boston at the Boston Phoenix who broke the Spotlight story before Spotlight. She's an extraordinary investigative reporter who's devoted most of her career to investigating sexual violence. And there are some in-depth tip sheets on this on the Dart Center website, which you should just find. But her advice is first of all, to explain very clearly why you need to do it, and not just blame it on your editor, but to say part of protecting you as a source and part of getting your story right is me and my editors knowing that we've been able to back up as much as we possibly can. Right. And Kristen says you want to flag the need for that pretty early in the reporting process. Not the first day if it's someone, you're just meeting, but if it turns out someone's going to cooperate with you on a story, you want to let them know pretty early on that there's going to be a process of verification and the kinds of things you may be asking, and that, there's some room for negotiation, but ultimately it's going to be very important to do it. And then you'll need to remind them of that from time to time, so doesn't feel like an ambush. Having a strategy. What is your strategy for corollary verification? What can you verify without sensitive documents from them? You can verify their employment. You can verify what the weather was like. You can verify whether there was in fact a party at that frat on that day. These are all things that don't involve going into someone's medical records or something. So you can promise them that you will be exhaustive in verifying what you can, but that finally some of these things are going to be important. And what Kristen Lombardi, who has done dozens of these interviews, says is, if not hundreds, is that first of all, you need to expect people to run hot and cold because this evokes a lot of fear. And I'll never show you my employment record or my medical records today doesn't mean that tomorrow necessarily. So you can keep working with them, come back on it. But if someone really is adamant that they won't show you this stuff, you need to be prepared to let them go as a source. Not because you don't believe them, but because it suggests that they're not really ready for prime time, that they're not going to be ready for the shitstorm that will hit when that story comes out. So this allows us to explain that everything we're going to ask is about getting their story right and protecting them as well as much as possible in the glare of news coverage. That's Kristen Lombardi's advice, and I would trust her with my own sister. Lucy, who's also figured out the Zoom hand.
Yeah, I was slower than Lauren. I'll say about that I have kind of a cautionary tale. I was working with a source on a story for months. He was clearly the victim of trauma, had lost a child in a violent way, presented me with all these public documents. I requested the public documents on my own, and in the course of reporting, found out he had altered the public documents to try to make himself look better because he felt like no reporter would do his story if he had the public documents as they existed.
Right.
So I, was almost at the finish line with this story and went to my bosses and said, we need to pull the plug on this because I can't trust this person. This person is clearly traumatized, but I can't do this story. And I had to have a very difficult conversation with this person saying, we're done. I'm sorry for your loss. I feel terrible for you as a parent. I can't imagine the hell you've gone through, but I can't talk to you anymore about this because you've completely ruined any trust we may have had. So
that's wild. If only he had only changed his private records,
right.
He wouldn't have found out. Right. But look, as I said earlier, first of all, trauma does not turn people into saints. They bring to the victimization whatever personality issues they had before. number one. Number two, the integrity of the reporting process is central to our respect for victims, right? We're not respecting them if we compromise on the reporting process at all, and we end up undermining the mission. And I cite the example of Rolling Stone, which was a complicated mess, but what the kind of most generous way of understanding what happened is that a reporter with a decent track record compromised her usual standards way too far, and the magazine compromised its regular standards way too far, and it nearly put Rolling Stone out of business. It has ended the reporter's career. It did severe damage to the quite profoundly troubled individual at the heart of the story. And even worse, the worst thing is that for like 2 years after that, a lot of editors around the country were really scared of campus sexual assault stories. It became and other kinds of rape stories. It became much harder for a couple of years to do that kind of work. So doing your homework and explaining to your sources why it's important and educating them a little bit about your process is important. It's the best way, the best insurance of against this kind of a situation.
Yeah.
You know,
I did have a question for you too, though,
Really,
rather than just rambling.
Huh.
So with this whole inner interview concept,
Mhm.
I'm wondering how, if you have advice for how to kind of prepare yourself for an interview where you know the topic may hit very close to home,
Right.
where you have to kind of keep yourself in check, and
Mhm.
whether there are times you should just say, I can't do this because it's going to hit too close to home. And I asked again with a personal example. I was working with a colleague on a story that involved talking to a woman whose son had killed himself. And I have a child who has depression and was going through
Yeah.
thoughts of self-harm. And I completely lost it. Thank God my TV colleague who was in the front and I was kind of in the back typing on my computer. But by the end of the interview, I was crying and I really couldn't keep my shit together.
Yeah.
And apologized to this mom we were talking to. She was great and was very understanding, but it made me wonder later, should I have just not even agreed to, I mean, that my TV colleague invited me to be part of the story. I felt like it was important. I thought I was prepared, but at the end I thought, man, that was a shit show. I wonder if
Yeah.
I should have just not even been part of that to begin with.
So here's how I think about it, and this is important, especially now because there are so many issues in the news that all of us in this Zoom and R relate to personally in one way or another, because of identity, because of experience, because of the community we're from, because of the underlying issues involved that we have personal identification with. First of all, here's what the science will tell you, that when we cover really distressing events that we identify with closely, whether it's because of race or ethnicity or people who are like us in some significant way, or in your case, a child, etc., those stories do get under our skin more, and they actually raise the risk. They're more on the risk. They raise the risk factors for reporters' own PTSD and other kinds of reactions. At the same time, our identity or our connection to these stories can be a source of real insight, right? So I don't believe in avoiding stories necessarily about people who we identify with or communities we're part of, or um, stories that we know are getting going. But I do advise, I do think it's important, first of all, in general, that we try to know our own signs a little bit, or be conscientious about recognizing stories that are likely to push our own buttons, because it can affect your journalism judgment. It's not just about, do you fall apart on the phone, but do you, compromise, and talking it through with a colleague, you know, um, ahead of time. is often a good idea. Hey, I'm going to be doing this story on suicide. I mean, I've been dealing with my son, and can I just talk this one through with you? That kind of thing can actually help lay a foundation for preparation, number one. Number two, if you have a general self-care practice, which was the subject of the last Zoominar, I'm not going to go into it here, but if you're working on a story that you identify with a little bit, whatever your self-care is, you want to up it while you're working on that story, and up the amount of kind of operational debriefing you're doing with colleagues. You want to stay connected to others. And you also want, if you run, you want to run more. If you, all of those kinds of things, you want some buffers that will help you keep your professional balance and use your connection as motivation and insight rather than being thrown off. Now, all of that said, sometimes we do stories that ambush us and what I think is important, Lucy, is not to be scared of that response, but to roll with it and try to learn from it. And that, again, to sit down with a colleague afterward and say, I want to talk through this last story I did with you. Or to, if you're a therapy person, talk to your therapist, but often peer support is really what's needed and most helpful in this, is simply think, well, what did I do right and well on that story? What was I challenged by? And what goes into my personal tip sheet for the next time I do this kind of story? It's about gaining some agency and control over a story that pushed your buttons. I think that's the way I would think. But does that make sense? Cool.
Anyone want a question? We've got limited to raise hands. I can throw one out.
You also just leap in if you haven't figured out the hand raising thing.
It's kind of like a news conference. One thing I do want to hit on before you go, Bruce, is in the world of special projects, which I've lived for 3 decades, we're dealing with people for months and months.
Yep.
And the issue is one of, as we get busy with other stories, the obvious trail off of that personal, contact.
Yeah.
And they, believe it or not, some get to like you.
Yeah.
And trust you to the point of where they lean on you. And that's always a difficult thing to manage. I've had it, not work out so well, but I have to say, just like I dealt with you during these moments, I now have other stories where people are in very bad ways. I've got to get to them, and they understand that, but there's an emotional disconnect that's very difficult. What do you recommend there?
It's never easy, especially on special projects that have taken months. I think sometimes I think reporters can do more in the kind of runway to a story's final publication or airing, where you're not saying I'm going to go away, but doing things like saying, well, when the paper comes out, maybe you want to have somebody else read it first, or maybe you want who are you going to watch the show with when it finally airs. Things that line up other supports for them, so that they're not in this kind of attenuated relationship with you.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, frankly, we benefit from that relationship. So there's a thing there.
Right. But it's sometimes you want to transition out of it if you can.
So bring it to that landing.
You want to think about landing. And at the same time, there's nothing wrong with maintaining contact with sources. If you've done well by them, they'll come back at you.
No, I definitely do that. And I think most people do. But the problem is that, they get attached, and and you're busier as a journalist than most of the people that you cover. So it's tough.
One of the most important conversations you can have sometimes as a reporter when you're working with folks like that is to yourself, here's what I can do for you and here's what I can't do for you, and really try to think that through, and then even explain that. I mean, sometimes, but certainly if you're on the terrain of working in depth with people who've suffered a lot of injury
Yeah.
and abuse, really have the conversation with yourself or with a colleague about here's what I can do and here's what I can't do.
Well, I mean,
So,
I even had a source recently out of the blue say, "You haven't called me in 2 months. What is wrong with you?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Out of the blue.
well, and
I'm like,
look, we also can't do anything about the fact that sometimes we do work with people who have big needs
yeah.
and we can't meet all those needs. And all you can do is you can say, gee, I'm sorry, you know. Um,
And other things, but
yeah.
hopefully not.
One more before we land the plane here, because I think we were at an hour. Was it an hour 15 or 90
Yes,
minutes?
sir. Hour 15. We
All right.
are coming right up on that.
Yeah.
So
What are-
whoever
what-
has final question, that'd be great. Anybody?
Just jump right in. Room full of reporters. Come on.
Observation, some maybe you have a piece of advice we haven't talked about.
Thomas, go for it.
Well, there is one, and Dwayne's familiar with this, and some of the people in Cincinnati are familiar with it. It's interesting when you have a traumatic experience that puts you a report on your own traumatic experience, which was kind of interesting. This goes back to 1980 when a gunman took over our TV station. Held 9 of us for 2 hours, blah, blah, blah. And when we get the station back, my assignment is to write the package on the guy who just held us for 2 hours. It was just interesting how that comes full circle. Never bothered me a moment because I talked it out so many times over the years, but it was just an interesting perspective of having to do that. And then having lunch with his ex-wife about 3 months later saying she was very surprised that anybody came out of it alive.
Well,
Sobering.
that's sobering. And it is, unfortunately, the number of times when we need to report on ourselves as the targets is growing.
Yeah.
But it is sobering. And I will tell you, I think Dwayne knows this. My whole engagement with trauma as a journalist comes out of exactly that experience, not a hostage situation, but another violent incident. In which I was, the thing I was talking about earlier, in which I was covered, even though I was a reporter, I was covered as the victim of crime, even though I was a crime reporter who had covered crime. And the two worlds kind of collide, and it makes you think, but it really does force us to confront the craft and ethics that we bring to the table. And it's important to try to learn from things like that. And actually, Thomas, as you were describing that story, I was thinking of a friend of mine who just died a couple of weeks ago, a really great journalist named Chris Kramer, who was the president of CNN International, the head of news for that. But before that had been the head of news at the BBC, where he was taken hostage during an occupation of the Iranian embassy in the 1980s. And Chris became him. He got out by faking a heart attack. Spectacular story. But he suffered a lot from post-traumatic stress disorder from this. And he became one of the first high-level champions of trauma awareness in our business as a consequence. My own, from the trauma science folks, I've learned that people who go through terrible events very often will take on, and this is important in working with our sources, will take on a kind of survivor mission, will be deeply motivated by a desire to have the horrible thing that they went through or the horrible loss of their family member, whatever it is, mean something and prevent another child from being shot at Parkland High School, or prevent another rape, or whatever it is. And our role as storytellers and witnesses in that survivor mission is really, really important. We are often the only bridge, the only kind of justice that people will have sometimes is a kind of narrative justice, the justice of having a journalist at least let the world know what happened. And that's important. Anyway, Dwayne, land the plane, get us out of here. You're muted, my friend.
So yeah, I can't even figure out the raised hand most. Listen, look, this was really, really helpful, Bruce. Thank you. We're always honored. You know, the really cool part, I'm glad you told that story because I never feel like I can, about how that serendipity, you know, that awful serendipity led to something greater. So you yourself are a living
Yeah.
example of how trauma isn't all a bad thing. That actually what we talk with people about are in stories is they want to do something to help others.
Yeah.
That's the cool part. So
Yeah,
you
it is.
did.
I mean, and two last things on that. First of
Sure.
all, there is such a thing, a whole field of study called post-traumatic growth. People who go through horrific experiences and reconfigure their lives, and we encounter that very often as journalists. I think that's really, really important. And also we must continue, despite the ethical sensitivity and all that, we must continue to take craft joy and craft pride in telling these stories well. That's often a hard thing to say to civilians, right? But you know, we don't need to be shy about being proud of really great trauma reporting and of the craft skills that we bring to it.
Well, and we bring great meaning by what we do. We tend to blow past it, but as
Yeah.
storytellers, we're framing something in a unique way that most people can't do. So our skill set brings great meaning and great clarity to what someone gets. So we can be part of the healing process, is
Yeah.
what you say,
Yeah.
Bruce.
Yeah, very
Um,
well, very much. Listen, I've put my email into chat, but I'm sure you'll send it around. And
Yeah,
also,
I put it in the chat as well, Bruce.
okay.
It's all there, and I think, Bruce, this is where you usually encourage people to go to the Dart Center. There's a lot of
Yep.
really useful things that are like things we can learn from. There's a
20
continuum.
years of backgrounders and tip sheets, more
Yeah.
than you want.
And really honestly, we're just really honored, Bruce. You did this out of the kindness of your heart at a much reduced rate, believe me. And so it's very helpful. But we're going to continue as a group to kind of take care of each other, which is one of the things that all groups need to do. So if you need to reach out to Bruce through his email, also you can go to dartcenter.org. And I really, really want to thank everybody for at least coming and doing something. It shows you really care about what we do. And the other thing, what Bruce has alluded to in both sessions in a very clear way, people around us need that support. Everyone here is a thought leader in the newsroom because you're taking time and you're caring enough about the growth. So help the people around you, give them what they need, because a lot of people are in crisis right now. Call if you want to, just make a call to a reporter. I'm trying to do that, and just say, hey, how's it going, man? Anything up? Do you need my help in any way? It doesn't really result sometimes in anything, but it's just nice to know that we care for each other. And you know, we have a unique experience. We got to do that because a lot of people are hurting right now. But look, we're going to continue with this program in some way, shape, or form. I want to thank Jenny and Tom and everyone at SPJ for embracing this, because that means SPJ is the real thought leader in the Cincinnati chapter, and of course the Mid-Michigan chapter, to try to do something. This is why we're here, to help each other. So if you need anything, we're all listed. Contact each other. I'm just so proud of all of you for being here. Hopefully we can help more in the future. And if you need to get a hold of me, I'll put it in the chat. This is going to live. So I'm going to put my personal email. Any other thoughts before we go, Bruce?
Just thank all of you. Go out and commit great acts of journalism.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce. You're the best. Thank you.
Good night, folks.
Good night.
Thank you.